The story of faithful Johannes. This is quite an odd one, even by the standards of the brothers Grimm. There's once a king who knew that the end of his life had come, and he called his faithful servant Johannes, his servant, his confidant, and said to Johannes, "You have served me well all these years. The kingdom, the land, will pass soon to my son. He is young. He has little experience of the world. I need you to promise me that you will serve him and that you will guide him as well as you have served me all these years. But the other promise I need from you is that you will never show my son the chamber that lies at the very end of the long hall, for within that chamber is a portrait of the Princess of the Golden Roof. And if my son sees that portrait, he will fall in love with her. And that will be a terrible thing for him and for the land." So Johannes promised, and promised that he would serve the king's son as the young king, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. So in due course, the prince became a king, and Johannes showed him every nook and cranny of the castle, every hall, every corridor, every vault, every room, every ounce of treasure, except one room at the end of the long corridor. And the prince began to ask about this room, and the thought of what was behind it was like an itch that he couldn't scratch. And so he asked Johannes time and time again, "What is it that is inside that room?" And no matter how many times Johannes said, It's really nothing, Your Majesty. It's really nothing." And the boy's curiosity grew and grew until eventually Johannes had to give in, and he had to unlock the door, and he had to let the young king see the portrait of the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. There she was, with her beauty, and splendidly dressed and bejewelled. And the young king fell instantly, truly, madly, deeply in love with her. And he said to Johannes, "She must be my wife. There is no one else that I can possibly share my life and my kingdom with." So Johannes came up with a plan as to how the king could visit the Princess of the Golden Roof. "There is much gold in your treasury, Your Majesty, and you have the most skilled goldsmiths. Get them to make beautiful things, get them to make trinkets, get them to make figures of animals, get them to make whatever they will, for the princess loves gold above all else." So the goldsmiths worked by day, the goldsmiths worked by night. And it wasn't long before, and the most amazing treasure trove of beautifully crafted gold things was made and was loaded onto a ship. And the king and Johannes disguised themselves as servants, and they sailed to the land where the Princess of the Golden Roof lived. And faithful Johannes placed in the pocket of his apron some of the most beautiful tiny little trinkets. And he went to the palace where the princess lived, and there in the gardens, drawing water from a well, was the princess' own maid. And when Johannes as the merchant's servant showed the maid the beautiful, intricate work of these tiny gold figurines, the maid said, "My mistress will want to buy much of what you have to sell." So Johannes was led to the private chamber of the Princess of the Golden Roof, and she was indeed intrigued by the workmanship of these golden things, and she agreed to go with Johannes to the ship where his master, the young king, waited. So the princess and the king, still disguised as a merchant, spent the rest of the day in his cabin, looking through all the beautiful, delicate golden things. And while this was going on, Johannes spoke to the captain, and as much sail was hoisted onto the mast as was possible, and the ship was cast off, and she sailed as fast as ever she had done across the sea. And the princess, as soon as the sun began to set, said that she wished to go home. So she left the cabin, walked out onto the deck, and was horrified to find herself on the high seas and far from home. And so she accused the young king of kidnapping her. But the king said, "I fell in love with your portrait, and then when I saw you in the flesh, I fell in love with you even more. The only thing that is going to make me happy is for you to be my wife, to be my queen, so that we may rule my land together." So the princess agreed to this. And so it looks as if we are headed towards a happy ever after. And yet, as Johannes sat on the deck of the ship, 3 ravens came and landed on the deck. Now, Johannes had this magical ability to understand the speech of ravens. And as the ravens spoke to each other, Johannes heard a story which he found most puzzling. The king has found his bride. Ah, but he will not keep her. But she sits at his side. But when the ship docks at the king's nation, there on the quayside will be a magnificent horse, as red as any fox. And the king will want to mount it and ride it back to the castle. But if he does so, he will die. And if anyone tells the king of this, that person will find themselves turned to stone, from the tips of their toes to their knees. Is nothing to be done? Something can be done. If someone else mounts the horse, takes the gun that is in the saddle holster, shoots it and kills it, then the king will be saved. Is there more to tell? There is more to tell. When the king gets to the castle, there, inside the door, in a stone vessel, will be the most magnificent bridegroom's outfit anyone has ever seen. And it looks as if it is woven from silver and gold, but really it is woven from sulphur and pitch. And if he wears it, it will burn him down to the bone. Is nothing to be done? If someone can pick up the enchanted shirt with gloved hands and throw it into the fire, all will be well. But is there more? There is more. There will be a ball at the castle, and the queen will dance. But as she dances, she will grow pale and will fall into a swoon. And if she is left there, she will die. But if someone draws the 3 drops of blood from her right breast, her life will be saved. But if anyone tells the king of this, they will be turned to stone from the tips of the toes to the top of the head. When the ship docked at the quayside, just as the ravens had foretold, there was a horse, a magnificent beast as red as a fox. And the king strode towards the horse, ready to ride it to the castle. But Johannes ran ahead of him, put his foot in the stirrup, swung himself up into the saddle, pulled out the gun from the holster that was there, and shot the poor creature dead. And the other servants, who didn't really like Johannes very much anyway, said, "What is Johannes doing? He has just shot that magnificent horse." And the king said, "Perhaps it is for the best." And so the whole party travelled up to the castle, and there, as the ravens had foretold, in a great stone vessel, was the most magnificent bridegroom's outfit, woven from silver and gold. But Johannes picked up the shirt in his gloved hands and threw it into the fire, where it burned very brightly. And the servants looked at each other and said, "What does Johannes think he's doing? He's just burned the king's bridegroom's outfit." But the king said, "Perhaps it is for the best." The king and the princess were married, so she became his queen. And in the evening of the wedding, they had a great ball, and the queen danced really beautifully. And Johannes watched her, but after some time she grew pale and fell down in a swoon. And Johannes lifted her gently, took her to a bedchamber, and drew from her right breast 3 drops of red blood, which he spat out onto the floor. And the king watched all this and was horrified, and said, "Take him to the prison. We will deal with him on the morrow." So the next morning, Johannes was due to be executed, and as he stood on the scaffold, he said, "Your Majesty, please let me explain." And Johannes told the story of what he had heard from the ravens, and why he had killed the horse, why he had burned the magnificent shirt, and why he had drawn the blood from the queen. But as he did so, as indeed the ravens had foretold, a wave of coldness flooded through him, and he found himself turned to stone. So there he stood, no more than a statue. And the king commanded that the statue be taken to his own chamber and placed next to his own bed. And for the next 2 years, 3 years, the king mourned for poor Johannes and missed him very much. But in that time, the queen gave birth, not to 1 son, but for 2, for their marriage was blessed with twins. And there came one day when the queen had gone to church, and the king was playing with his small sons. And he looked at the statue of Johannes, and he said out loud, "I miss you so much, Johannes. I wish you were here." And the statue began to speak and said, "You can bring me back, Your Majesty, but it does require great sacrifice. Take a sword, cut off the heads of both your sons, use their blood to smear on my statue, and I will awake." Now the king, he may have hesitated for a little bit, but he took his sword, he decapitated his sons, he took their blood and smeared it over Johannes' stone body. And in that moment, Johannes opened his eyes, opened his mouth, began to speak, and began to move. And the first thing that the living Johannes did was he took each of the twins' heads and placed them on their bodies. And they joined together as if nothing had ever happened. And the twin sons had no memory of this. And by the time the Queen arrived home from church, they were playing happily with faithful Johannes and with their father, the king. So the king and the queen had a long and happy life, as indeed I hope shall all of you. Maybe that's a story we don't really feel hugely comfortable with. The image of people, well, someone magically understanding the speech of ravens does, of course, appear in the Norse Viking story of how Fafnir became a dragon, where Sigurd eats a dragon's heart, and then he can understand the speech of birds, and the birds again give him a warning. That image does appear in quite a lot of stories. Ravens, of course, are carrion feeders, and they would have a great feast after a battle. Ravens and wolves are generally associated with feeding on the flesh of defeated warriors. There's quite a lot of stories about people, usually brothers, being turned into ravens and then being rescued. In the Irish tradition, brothers are usually turned into swans and are rescued by a younger sister. In Irish myth, your soul is taken to the next world on the back of a swan, which is a beautiful image. And when you see swans, particularly at night, they do look a little bit otherworldly. So the story of the 12 Ravens is coming up. So do subscribe to my channel. The story of how Fafnir became a dragon. That's also one of my YouTube videos. So have fun, listen to stories, tell stories, live long and prosper.